The war on the Eastern Front began as a campaign of encirclements and mass captures. Between June and December 1941, German army groups north, center, and south executed operations at Bialystok, Minsk, Smolensk, Uman, Kiev, and Vyazma-Bryansk that placed entire Soviet formations inside pockets. By the end of 1941, German authorities held roughly 3.3 to 3.8 million Red Army prisoners. By 1944, the total reached approximately 5.7 million. The camp network, gulags at the front, stalags in the rear, O-flags for officers, and makeshift enclosures at rail junctions, was under-resourced. Food allotments in many field enclosures fell below subsistence during the first winter. Disease spread in open-air compounds without adequate shelter. By conservative estimates, about 3.0 million Soviet prisoners died in German custody over the course of the war. These conditions form the essential background to any discussion of why some prisoners entered German service. German policy towards Soviet prisoners in 1941 combined security directives with labor exploitation aims. The Commissar Order and guidance on political screening separated political officers, Jews, and suspected NKVD personnel from the general prisoner population. These categories were treated as security threats and removed from labor pools. For the mass of captives, the Wehrmacht and the Reich ministries faced contradictory imperatives: denying resources to the Soviet state while extracting labor for the German war economy. Through the second half of 1941, transportation bottlenecks and an assumption of rapid victory limited investment in prisoner maintenance. As the front stabilized in late 1941 and Germany's labor demand rose, policy began to shift towards systematic employment and recruitment from the camps. Inside the Soviet Union, the state framed capture as betrayal. On 16 August 1941, Order Number 270 defined surrender as a criminal act. Relatives of captured officers face sanctions. This policy did not cause mass surrender, which resulted primarily from operational encirclements, but it shaped later decisions by prisoners contemplating return, escape, or collaboration. In a soldier's calculus, survival in captivity, the risk of retribution at home, and the possibility of work under German authority interacted with beliefs formed before the war, attitudes toward collectivization, memories of the 1930s famine, national and regional identities, and prior encounters with Soviet administration. The term Hilfswillige, abbreviated as Hiwi, appeared in Wehrmacht usage for auxiliary volunteers. In practice, the category encompassed a spectrum: camp laborers attached to army groups, drivers and cooks in divisional services, translators and orderlies, construction workers and pioneer units, trench diggers assigned to core rear areas, and later, combat-adjacent roles such as ammunition carriers and stretcher-bearers in infantry regiments. Separate formations existed outside the Hiwi label: Schutzmannschaft battalions for security and police tasks, Ostbataillon raised from POWs and civilians for field service under German officers, and national legions recruited in the rear of Army Group A and B from Caucasian and Turkestani populations. The lines between categories often blurred at the front, where divisional commanders adjusted assignments to immediate needs. Numbers varied by time and place. In late 1941, ad hoc recruitment began at the level of divisions and corps, sometimes without formal authorization, to address shortages of drivers, cooks, and pioneer labor. By spring 1942, the OKH issued guidelines that regularized the process, expanding quotas for auxiliaries. In some austere infantry divisions on the central sector in 1942 to 1943, Hiwis reached 5 to 10% of overall strength, concentrated in service companies but also present in line battalions as unarmed or lightly armed support. Security commands in the rear employed larger proportions for guard duty, rail repair, and anti-partisan operations. The Reich Labor Ministry and industrial concerns sought contingents for factories. Military leaders resisted excessive transfers that would strip the front. The result was a negotiated distribution between field armies, SS, and police commands, and economic agencies. For prisoners, recruitment paths typically began with screening at a dulag or stalag. Interrogation teams, often with interpreters drawn from earlier recruits, identified language skills, technical experience, and physical fitness. Offers varied. Immediate access to rations above camp level in exchange for non-combat labor. Transfer to heated quarters near field kitchens, clothing and footwear, pay accounts denominated in Reichskreditkasse or camp scrip. In some cases, refusal meant remaining in open compounds through winter conditions. In others, refusal had no immediate sanction, but left the prisoner in the general camp population. Coercion appeared in different forms: threats of reassignment to harsher labor detachments, pressure applied by camp capos or guards, or the simple fact of hunger in a closed system with limited alternatives. Ideology interacted with necessity rather than replacing it. Anti-Soviet convictions existed among prisoners from certain regions and social backgrounds, and some expressed hopes of national autonomy under German patronage. Others sought distance from the Soviet state without adopting German war aims. Many framed the choice as temporary survival, a reversible step to obtain food, shelter, or a chance to escape the camp system, with future options undefined. Among German officers, views also diverged. Some emphasized military utility and argued that auxiliaries freed German soldiers for combat. Others raised security concerns and questioned reliability near the front. SS and police leaders sought manpower for rear area operations, and later for anti-partisan warfare, where the risks of defection and reprisals were high, but the need for personnel remained constant. The battlefield context of 1942 magnified these dynamics. German casualties on the Eastern Front increased as operations extended toward the Volga and the Caucasus. Replacement flows lagged. Divisions that entered 1941 with established tables of organization found themselves short of drivers, cooks, and pioneers by the second campaign season. The demand for local labor coincided with camp populations large enough to supply it. In Army Group Center and South, staff officers reported improved divisional mobility, when auxiliary drivers and mechanics filled shortages. In Army Group North, siege conditions around Leningrad created separate pressures for labor on fortifications and logistics networks. Against this operational backdrop, the category Hiwi moved from improvisation to structure. Soviet authorities tracked these developments through prisoner interrogations, partisan reports, and frontline observation. Soviet publications depicted auxiliaries as traitors, while internal memoranda distinguished between forced laborers, local police, and combat units. After 1943, the Red Army's repatriation and filtration system developed procedures to screen returning POWs and civilian laborers. These later policies would shape the post-war outcomes for those who had served in German formations, but at the point of recruitment in 1941 to 1942, knowledge of future treatment was limited and often based on rumor. This pre-war and early war context explains the pressures operating on both sides. A German army balancing security doctrine with manpower needs, a prisoner population navigating survival within a camp system, and a Soviet state whose punitive definitions of surrender complicated individual choices. The phenomenon described as Hiwis emerged at the intersection of these structures, before the more visible formations and controversies of the later war years took shape. Encirclements in summer-autumn 1941 created the human flow that made auxiliary service possible. Columns of captives from Bialystok, Minsk in late June, then Smolensk in July, Uman in August, and Kiev in September moved under field guards to temporary collecting points. From there, rail detachments distributed prisoners to transit camps labeled Dulag, with 3-digit numbers aligned to army areas, and then to permanent stalags in the Reichskommissariat Ostland, Reichskommissariat Ukraine, or further west for labor allocation. Each transfer reduced rations through delays, and each rail node generated new detachments for local work details. By the time the Vyazma-Bryansk pockets closed in October 1941, the system was operating at capacity, tens of thousands per week entering dulags designed for a fraction of that figure. German field quartermasters and medical officers reported shortages of tents, cookers, and disinfection equipment. Mortality in open enclosures rose with night temperatures below freezing. Screening teams formed the first gate to any recruitment path. At dulags close to the front, the Wehrmacht IC, intelligence sections, and Feldgendarmerie separated political officers, party functionaries, and other categories designated for security handling by SS and police. Technical specialists, drivers, mechanics, radio operators, and medical orderlies were tagged for priority labor. Interpreters were drawn early from Baltic, Ukrainian, or Caucasian captives, with German or Polish language skills. The net effect was triage under conditions of scarcity. Some groups were removed from any pool, others were retained for immediate use by field formations. The remainder entered the general camp population, awaiting transport. Local commanders issued authorizations for ad hoc work detachments when roads, bridges, or dumps needed hands. In August-September 1941, these detachments were still temporary and unstandardized. A division might hold 50 to 100 prisoners as cooks, drivers, or trench diggers without a common label. Initial movements from camp to unit followed a consistent chain. A regimental adjutant requested labor from the division quartermaster. The division submitted a quota to the Army Corps. The Corps negotiated with the Army's prisoner affairs officer, who coordinated with Dulag Command. When a batch arrived, medical inspection and delousing, preceded issue of captured Soviet clothing, remarked with colored patches or German depot garments without insignia. Identification discs made of fiberboard or aluminum carried a Dulag or Stalag number and a subdetachment code. Pay, where offered, was recorded in company books as credit rather than cash. Rations matched German field category 3 or 4 only on paper. Actual delivery depended on transport and kitchen capacity. Even this imperfect arrangement represented a step up from camp fare and became a primary incentive to accept attachment. Command structures in late 1941 reflected improvisation. An austere infantry division of roughly 9,000 to 11,000 Germans in the field might concentrate 300 to 600 attached auxiliaries if supply and pioneer needs were acute. The proportions were uneven. Divisional supply columns, bakeries, and field workshops absorbed the largest shares. Pioneer battalions drew manpower for bridging and wire laying. Infantry regiments used smaller numbers as ammunition carriers and stretcher bearers. Arming remained restricted. In most formations through winter 1941 to 1942, attached personnel carried no rifles and performed tasks near, but not in, the line. Exceptions occurred when defensive gaps opened and commanders issued captured carbines with limited ammunition for emergency posts. Reliability assessments from battalions varied. Some noted steady work under supervision. Others recorded desertions when units halted in villages with partisan activity. German higher headquarters sought to bring order to this spread. Army Group Center reported in November 1941 that divisions were retaining prisoners without clear accounting, complicating ration and transport tables. The General Quartiermeister's staff circulated guidance that winter to standardize categories, introduce basic vetting, and assign responsibility for rations and discipline to the receiving unit. The term Hilfswillige, already used informally, gained currency as a catch-all for prisoners attached to military units on a voluntary basis, although voluntariness was conditioned by the camp environment. Parallel channels developed for security and police duties under higher SS and police leaders, forming Schutzmannschaft battalions for guard and anti-partisan tasks. This bifurcation mattered. A man attached to a bakery company fell under divisional military law. A man placed in a Schutzmannschaft unit answered to police command and operated mainly in the rear. On the Soviet side, the opening phase created a second gate that influenced choices. Command regulations in the summer of 1941 ordered units to fight out of encirclements. Many did not reach friendly lines. Knowledge of order. Number 270, issued on August 16, 1941, spread unevenly, often via rumor. Families of captured officers risked sanctions. Rank-and-file soldiers faced the prospect of filtration on return. In this context, the calculus for a prisoner approached by a German non-commissioned officer with an offer of kitchen duty combined variables that were not strictly military: the probability of surviving the camp winter, the chance to secure footwear, the opportunity to position oneself near front lines for escape, and the risk of being labeled a collaborator if repatriated. These were individual assessments made under pressure, rather than expressions of fixed ideology. The battlefield environment shaped availability and demand. In Army Group North, the protracted struggle around Leningrad demanded continuous labor for corduroy roads, trench systems, and winter positions. Divisions there attached work details earlier and more continuously than formations on open terrain. In Army Group Center, the retreat from the approaches to Moscow in December 1941 cut many detachments off from their parent dulags. Some auxiliaries were left behind or captured by advancing Soviet forces, while others remained with German units through the winter. In Army Group South, where operations moved along better roads into Ukraine, supply columns recruited drivers familiar with local routes. Comparative figures from autumn 1941 show German infantry divisions carrying fighting strengths reduced to 6,000 to 7,500 men after months of combat. Attached labor, while not counted in rifle companies, helped keep those reduced formations moving. Recruitment language in the opening phase was functional rather than ideological. Notices posted at dulags offered improved rations for cooks, bakers, drivers, and carpenters. Divisional orders emphasized security measures, constant supervision, separation from weapons depots, curfew hours, and set maximum shares of auxiliaries per company. Some commanders, citing alarm at midnight desertions, rotated attached men through work parties rather than assigning them permanently. Others found that stable assignment to kitchens or workshops reduced turnover. The data remained local and anecdotal. Comprehensive statistics did not yet exist. What persisted across sectors was the link between camp conditions and unit demand. Wherever prisoner maintenance fell below subsistence and divisions lacked hands, the path from gate to company kitchen, pioneer trench, or supply column opened quickly. By early February 1942, the opening improvisations had produced a recognizable pattern. Field forces had discovered tasks that auxiliaries could do reliably under guard. Camp authorities had identified the basic screening profile for labor detachments, and the vocabulary, dulag to stalag, detachment to division, Hilfswillige for attached personnel, had settled. The system was not yet codified at the level of the entire Ostheer, but the first phase had established routes by which a Soviet prisoner could move from an open enclosure into a German military unit, with immediate consequences for survival, and with longer-term implications that neither side fully defined at the time. Planning for auxiliary use matured in winter 1941 to 1942, as front commands converted emergency measures into routine. German goals were layered. At the operational level, field armies sought to stabilize divisional services that had been depleted by casualties and long supply lines. At the economic level, ministries in Berlin demanded labor for rail repair, grain collection, and construction. At the security level, SS and police leaders required personnel for guard and patrol duties in rear zones where rail sabotage and partisan activity increased. Each layer produced directives that sometimes aligned and sometimes competed. Army Group Center requested fixed monthly quotas of drivers and pioneers for divisions facing poor roads and thaw conditions. Army Group South prioritized harvest logistics and bridge work along the Dnieper and Don. Army Group North concentrated on fortifications and winter quarters. The General Quartiermeister attempted to standardize categories: kitchen and bakery helpers, wagon and motor drivers, mechanics, medical orderlies, pioneer laborers, so that ration scales, supervision, and liability would be uniform across corps. German planning instruments reflected these aims. Staffs created tables that capped attached auxiliaries per company to preserve accountability and reduce the risk of uncontrolled growth. Corps prisoner of war officers coordinated with dulag commandants to assemble batches with basic skill mixes, roughly 1 driver to 4 laborers, with at least 1 interpreter per company-sized detachment. Medical inspection and delousing became mandatory steps before issue of clothing and tools. Arming rules remained restrictive. Unarmed status was the default, with exceptions authorized by regimental commanders for ammunition carriers, stretcher bearers under fire, or guarded sentry pairs and depots. Where captured Soviet carbines were issued, ammunition allotments were limited and collected after duty. The intent was to free German soldiers for line tasks without creating parallel armed formations inside divisions. Resource calculations were explicit. A standard infantry division that had entered the war with approximately 15,000 personnel, but now fielded 6,500 to 9,000 effectives, could increase 60 to 120 auxiliary drivers, kept divisional motor pools functional. Pioneer battalions reported higher output on bridging and wire laying, when reinforced by 100 to 200 laborers under German non-commissioned officers. Field bakeries and butchery detachments documented higher bread and meat throughput when staffed with 20 to 40 kitchen helpers. In some corps, this translated to 5 to 8% of divisional headcount and attached auxiliaries during 1942, concentrated in services rather than rifle platoons. Planning tables converted these shares into ration and transport requirements, allocating additional flour, fat, and fuel to units that took on prisoner labor. Competition from the economy reshaped plans in spring 1942. The plenipotentiary for labor deployment pressed for mass transfers of Soviet prisoners to factories and mines in the Reich and in occupied territories. Armament planners argued that rail repair brigades and coal output would shorten supply bottlenecks that also affected the front. Army leaders countered that stripping divisions of drivers and pioneers would reduce operational mobility. The compromise created parallel flows. Selected contingents moved to industry. Others remained in field formations as Hiwis. Still others entered police and Schutzmannschaft units under higher SS and police leaders. The result required joint quota conferences at Army and Army Group level to avoid double claims on the same camp populations. Miscalculations were frequent. Rail schedules failed, batches arrived with skill mismatches, or detachments were diverted en route to meet sudden local demands. Propaganda, used by all parties, served planning rather than principle. German leaflets tailored to camp audiences highlighted food, clothing, and protection against the winter for those who took up defined roles. Posters at dulags listed trades sought: drivers, carpenters, tailors, cobblers, linking them to named units. Divisions issued orders that recruitment pitches focus on practical incentives and avoid political statements that would complicate security vetting. Soviet information organs answered with warnings, broadcast across front lines, that auxiliaries would face criminal liability if captured, and later, with detailed instructions for interrogating and classifying Hiwis who fell into Red Army hands. Both sides treated messaging as a tool to shift individual choices at the margin. Soviet planning responded on two tracks. At the front, political departments and special sections tightened control measures, introduced identity checks in units reforming after encirclement, and compiled lists of soldiers missing in pockets to clarify who might have been captured. In the interior, NKVD and military commands began designing filtration procedures for returnees, first at improvised checkpoints, later in organized filtration camps, anticipating the need to separate coerced laborers from those who had served in police or armed detachments. Orders defined categories for investigation, established commission structures with military, party, and security representatives, and set time limits for case reviews. This framework did not prevent capture or recruitment, but it signaled the state's intention to classify and penalize certain forms of service under German authority, and it influenced the calculations of prisoners who still expected to re-enter Soviet jurisdiction. Doctrinal considerations were explicit in German planning notes. Commanders emphasized that auxiliaries were to augment, not replace, German combat power. In infantry regiments, this translated to assignments at battalion trains, ammunition supply, and casualty evacuation, with clear instructions that Hiwis would not occupy machine gun posts or command positions. Pioneers used auxiliaries for timber cutting, fascine preparation, trench revetment, and road surface maintenance. Medical companies trained selected auxiliaries as stretcher bearers under German medics, specifying hand signals and evacuation routes to minimize language-related errors under fire. Reliability measures included pairing auxiliaries with German handlers, fixed sleeping quarters under guard, curfews, and withholding of weapons. Leave policies did not apply. Instead, good conduct could bring better clothing or improved rations. Logistics framed every step. Planning officers mapped the pathway from camp to unit as a chain with measurable losses. Initial prisoner intake at a dulag, medical triage reducing the pool by disease, transport losses through delays or diversions, and final assignment. Each link had a cost in rail capacity, guards, and administrative effort. To justify continued recruitment, divisions reported output metrics, kilometers of road maintained, tons of ammunition moved, bread loaves baked per day, attributed to auxiliary labor, where figures showed measurable gains, corps extended authorizations, where desertion reports rose or security incidents occurred, quotas were reduced or categories restricted. Security estimates were comparative. Army Group Center recorded that desertions from pioneer work details dropped when detachments were quartered closer to German units and rotated through tasks with regular supervision. Army Group South noted higher rates of disappearance among guards placed on isolated depots in steppe sectors, leading to revisions in sentry placement and nighttime movement rules. Police commands assessed Schutzmannschaft reliability by battalion and region, adjusting deployment toward rail security and away from independent operations when defection risk appeared high. None of these estimates assumed uniform behavior. All were based on observed rates within specific formations and districts. Finally, planning addressed what would happen if the front shifted rapidly. Divisions drew up withdrawal checklists that included whether to retain, evacuate, or release attached auxiliaries during retreats. Some corps ordered that Hiwis be moved with unit trains to prevent abandonment. Others directed that detachments be returned to the nearest dulag if march capacity was limited. These decisions had direct consequences for individuals and for later legal classification. In sum, strategic goals and planning on both sides treated the Hiwi phenomenon as a managerial problem. Allocate scarce manpower, control risk, and sustain operations. The instruments, quotas, tables, screening, and messaging, were precise, but the environment in which they operated remained unstable, producing outcomes that differed by sector, season, and command. The first sustained test of auxiliaries near the front came with winter fighting in 1941 to 1942, when German formations withdrew from the approaches to Moscow and stabilized lines around Rzhev, Toropets, and the Volkhov. In infantry divisions reduced to 6,500 to 8,000 effectives, attached personnel concentrated in trains, kitchens, and pioneer tasks, but moved under fire as ammunition carriers and stretcher bearers. Battalion logs from this period note that auxiliary teams accompanied resupply sleds to platoon strongpoints after dusk, while German riflemen held trenches. When counterattacks forced hasty retreats, drivers from camp detachments brought horse teams and light trucks forward to remove mortars and machine guns. These movements exposed unarmed or lightly armed auxiliaries to small arms and artillery fire. Desertions occurred in sectors where woods and villages offered cover towards Soviet lines. In open snowfields, return to the Red Army was rarer. German companies recorded fewer disappearances when auxiliaries slept within guarded cantonments and rotated through fixed tasks. Losses increased when detachments were scattered across isolated dumps or depots. At Leningrad's Southern Arc in January, March 1942, divisions of the 18th Army relied on auxiliary labor to keep corduroy roads and trench systems usable during freeze-thaw cycles. A divisional pioneer battalion that had entered the war with 3 companies could double its daily output of fascines and revetments by assigning 150 to 200 auxiliaries under German non-commissioned officers. The effect registered in mobility. Artillery regiments with 72 to 96 guns maintained more consistent ammunition flow when 60 to 80 auxiliary drivers remained at the wheel, while German drivers transferred into gun crews. In exchange, ration scales for these detachments approached German Category 4 on paper, though delivery varied with convoy schedules. Soviet attempts to pierce the ring across the Neva and at the Volkhov created sudden demands for evacuation under fire. On several nights, auxiliary stretcher bearers evacuated casualties from forward positions to battalion aid posts, then to divisional clearing stations. Where captured carbines were issued for close-in sentry posts, ammunition allotments were limited to a few clips and collected at shift end. In the Demyansk and Cholm pockets, January to May 1942, airlift defined auxiliary work. With 6 divisions encircled around Demyansk and a smaller group at Cholm, daily tonnage needs in the larger pocket ran above 200 tons, rising with weather and combat intensity. Airfields had to be kept clear and serviceable. Pioneers directed auxiliary labor to snow removal, runway repair, and unloading. When sorties peaked, ground crews and auxiliaries worked in shifts to clear cargo within hours to reduce aircraft turnaround. German commanders restricted armed roles to perimeter trench segments under direct supervision, using auxiliaries mainly to free German soldiers for defense. For individuals, the pocket environment offered better rations than open camps, but carried the risk of being trapped if the line failed. After the land corridor reopened to Demyansk in April, many detachments were evacuated with their divisions. Others were returned to gulags when units reconstituted. In the south, spring 1942 brought different demands. The Second Battle of Kharkov in May required bridging and road repair as mechanized corps maneuvered on both sides. Army Group South prioritized auxiliary drivers for supply columns feeding infantry and panzer divisions. A division with a nominal 800 to 1,000 horses and 200 to 300 vehicles increased operational reach when auxiliary teamsters maintained horse lines and wagons, while German drivers concentrated on motorized columns. On the Soviet side, the encirclement of large forces east of Kharkov altered the prisoner population again, adding contingents familiar with steppe routes and city infrastructure. Some detachments were formed directly from new captures, shortening the path from dulag to unit by days. The tactical outcome, a German victory with Soviet losses in personnel and equipment, expanded both camp populations and field detachments, reinforcing the administrative patterns established over the winter. Security operations in Belarus demonstrated a separate use case in early 1942. As rail sabotage increased between Vitebsk, Orsha, and Mogilev, security divisions and police regiments formed guard companies in which former prisoners served under German or local police command. Tasks included track patrols, bridge sentry duty, and escort of repair trains. These were armed details, but deployment was structured to reduce defection risk, mixed posts, limited ammunition issue, and frequent rotation. When larger sweeps were launched against suspected partisan bases, auxiliaries served as guides and porters, while German infantry and police battalions provided the main combat elements. Civilian impact followed patrol routes and requisition points. In villages along rail lines, requisition lists included food and winter clothing to sustain guards through night shifts. Reports from these districts recorded tensions between local residents and guard detachments. Security staffs reacted by rotating units to prevent fixed relationships that might facilitate desertion or intelligence leaks. On the central sector, the Vzhyev-Vyazma battles in 1942 brought prolonged positional warfare, with daily raids and counter-raids across forest belts and river lines. Auxiliary trench workers deepened forward foxholes, cut firing lanes, and constructed timber bunkers. Ammunition carriers moved 7.92 mm and 50 mm mortar rounds to company dumps along marked tracks. Medical orderlies trained from auxiliary ranks brought wounded to sled collection points. In emergencies, regimental commanders authorized temporary arming of ammunition carriers to hold intermediate posts, emphasizing that weapons would be collected after relief. Observed outcomes varied by unit. Some regiments reported steady work and no security incidents over weeks. Others recorded disappearances during blizzards or in sectors adjacent to partisan activity. The same variability appeared in Soviet reports of captured auxiliaries. Some claimed coercion and sought immediate return to Soviet units. Others were classified for detailed screening by special sections. August to September 1942 illustrated limits and spillovers. As German 6th Army converged on the city and 4th Panzer Army turned north from the Don Bend, auxiliary employment in supply and pioneer roles extended across lengthening lines. With daily ammunition consumption rising in urban fighting, artillery regiments firing hundreds of tons per day, supply columns employed auxiliary drivers to keep pace. When Soviet counterattacks along the Don forced temporary withdrawals, detachments were sometimes left on the wrong side of a river, or diverted to new parent units by corps quartermasters. In a few cases, improvised rifle companies assembled from trained personnel, headquarters clerks, and attached labor-held trench segments while infantry battalions regrouped. Where auxiliaries participated, they did so under German non-commissioned officers with limited ammunition. The immediate outcome was local stabilization. The longer-term consequence was that these detachments crossed a boundary from support into combat-adjacent roles, complicating later classification. Morale effects were mixed on all sides. German soldiers and rifle companies often welcomed additional hands that kept kitchens operating and ammunition moving. Some expressed reservations about reliability in forward areas. Soviet troops encountering auxiliaries in recaptured villages recorded a spectrum of behavior, from immediate surrender to attempts to hide among civilians. Civilians observed uniforms without insignia, colored patches, and mixed languages in roadside work parties. Some traded food or services, others avoided contact. Propaganda adapted. German notices in camps stressed safer rear area tasks. Soviet leaflets at the front warned that service as a guard or armed auxiliary would be treated differently from coerced labor on roads or kitchens. The first engagements in which attached personnel came under fire or took temporary posts did not produce a single turning point. They established patterns of risk and practice that would be repeated and scaled in the campaigns of 1942, bringing the category from administrative solution into the daily routine of a moving front. By late 1942, the auxiliary system expanded under pressure from simultaneous fronts: urban attrition on the Volga, mobile operations in the steppe, and a rising tempo of rail sabotage and partisan warfare in the rear. Field commands formalized tables for attached personnel and extended their use into divisional signals, medical, and artillery services. Corps quartermasters adjusted motor pools so that auxiliary drivers handled routine convoy legs, while German drivers concentrated on contested approaches to forward dumps. Pioneer battalions built winter lines using mixed teams. German non-commissioned officers supervised timber cutting and revetment, while auxiliary laborers moved fascines, gabions, and barbed wire. Ration scales, clothing issues, and billet arrangements were set on paper with increasing precision. In practice, delivery rates fluctuated with supply. The overall result was escalation by normalization. Tasks first improvised in 1941 became standard components of divisional daily orders. Security forces in occupied territories simultaneously widened their reliance on former prisoners. Schutzmannschaft battalions and Bundeswehr guard units took on rail line patrols, bridge posts, and convoy escort. When large sweeps were planned in Belarus and northern Ukraine, police regiments formed columns in which former POWs marched as guides, stretcher bearers, and porters, while German police battalions and attached artillery provided the core combat elements. Commanders imposed controls designed to limit defection: mixed sentry pairs, restricted ammunition, short rotations on isolated posts, and periodic replacement of companies between districts. Reports compared desertion rates by terrain and season. Wooded sectors with active partisan bases produced higher losses than open agricultural districts with denser road networks. Civilian contact remained a variable. Markets around garrisons created channels for barter. Curfew and requisition rules attempted to regulate those exchanges without eliminating them. The crisis sharpened around the Stalingrad pocket in November 1942, February 1943. Once encirclement closed, auxiliary detachments already embedded in supply, medical, and pioneer services faced the same constraints as German personnel: ration reductions, exposure during sorties to forward strong points, and limited evacuation options. Some detachments were flown out with technical specialists during early airlift phases. Others remained in perimeter sectors as litter bearers, ammunition carriers, or kitchen crews. When the pocket capitulated, returning Soviet authorities interrogated captured auxiliaries alongside German personnel, applying emerging classification schemes that distinguish between unarmed labor under guard and participation in armed posts. The immediate military consequence for the German side was a loss of trained attached labor in several divisions, forcing reconstitution from dulags and stalags in Army Groups Center and South during spring 1943. The Caucasus Campaign demonstrated different recruitment channels. Army Group A advanced through regions with non-Russian populations whose languages and local knowledge were valued by field staffs. Camp screening teams and propaganda detachments sought drivers, interpreters, and scouts from among captured soldiers familiar with mountain roads or oil installations. Divisions assembled small language squads to interface with village elders for requisitions and road labor, often pairing an auxiliary interpreter with a German liaison. As the front reversed in early 1943, these detachments faced choices shaped by geography. Some retreated across passes with their parent units, others were left at depots and reabsorbed into camp systems. The operational lesson recorded in Corps diaries was that local knowledge accelerated movement and negotiation, but was hard to retain during withdrawals. Standardization attempts continued at higher headquarters during this period. Orders clarified that attached auxiliaries did not change the authorized strength of German units. They supplemented specific functions and remained administratively distinct. Uniform guidance allowed issue of German depot clothing, without insignia or marked civilian garments. Identification discs bore camp or detachment codes. Weapon policy remained restrictive, with authorization for specific armed posts, depot sentries, litter bearers in contested corridors, or ammunition carriers in urban sectors, subject to collection after duty. Pay bookkeeping improved. Company clerks recorded credits in ledgers, with deductions for clothing and mess. Medical companies expanded training syllabi, so that auxiliary stretcher bearers learned evacuation routes, hand signals, and bandaging standards under German medics, reducing miscommunication in low visibility conditions. Escalation had parallel effects on Soviet planning. As filtration procedures matured in early 1943, Red Army and NKVD organs issued instructions that codified categories for returnees: civilians conscripted for labor, unarmed camp workers, security auxiliaries, and those assigned armed tasks near the front. Interrogation templates asked about unit designations, command chains, months and locations of service, and whether weapons were issued permanently or temporarily. At the same time, front-level propaganda refined messages aimed at wavering auxiliaries in German lines, promising case-by-case review for those who crossed over, and warning of criminal liability for participation in punitive operations. These measures sought to influence decisions at the margin in sectors where auxiliary detachments were posted close to Soviet trenches or partisan zones. On the German side, manpower calculations tied escalation directly to divisional survivability. Infantry divisions operating at 6,500 to 9,000 effectives documented increases in daily ammunition throughput when 60 to 80 auxiliary drivers remained continuously on supply vehicles. Pioneers reported kilometer counts for road repair and trench deepening that matched levels otherwise unattainable without diverting riflemen from line duty. Artillery groups noted steadier resupply when auxiliaries handled depot tasks so that German drivers could shuttle forward under fire. These quantifiable outputs justified continued quotas even as critics warned about security risks. Where incidents occurred, isolated posts overrun, sentry pairs disappearing, Corps adjusted deployment patterns rather than abandoning the system, concentrating auxiliaries in supervised clusters around kitchens, workshops, and train parks. The crisis phase also produced visible spillovers into Ost field formations. Alongside unit-attached Hiwis and police battalions, Army and Corps staffs expanded Eastern battalions with former POWs and civilians, commanded by German officers and NCOs. Employment varied, In quiet sectors, these battalions performed trench and patrol duties. Before major offensives, they were withdrawn to avoid exposure to breakthrough shock. During retreats, some were tasked with rearguard road work. Transfers westward began for selected battalions to garrison Atlantic Wall sectors, reflecting a view that they could relieve German units in lower threat environments while reducing defection risk near their home regions. This redistribution did not end auxiliary use at the front. It rebalanced burdens between field armies, security forces, and occupation garrisons as the Eastern Theater moved toward larger operations in summer 1943. For individuals, escalation changed the calculus, but not the structure of choices. Hunger and exposure remained baseline pressures in camps. Attachment to a unit improved survival odds with better rations and shelter. Risks increased where armed posts and proximity to combat blurred lines between labor and fighting. Information about future treatment upon capture circulated unevenly, shaped by rumor and local experience. Commanders on all sides treated the phenomenon as a management problem: allocate labor, minimize losses, and maintain control. As 1943 opened with retreats from the Volga and the Caucasus, the auxiliary system had become embedded in the daily functioning of divisions, corps, and security commands, setting conditions for its role in the larger engagements to come. Summer 1943 marked the peak deployment of auxiliaries in field and rear roles as the Eastern Front entered a phase of large, concentrated operations. In July, German forces opened Operation Zitadelle against Soviet Central and Voronezh fronts. The attacking force, roughly 780,000 to 900,000 personnel, with about 2,700 to 3,000 tanks and assault guns, met defenders totaling approximately 1,200,000 to 1,300,000 personnel, with around 3,300 to 3,600 tanks and self-propelled guns. Within German orders of battle, divisional returns show attached auxiliaries concentrated in supply columns, pioneer battalions, medical companies, and artillery parks. Infantry divisions that fielded 7,500 to 10,500 Germans in rifle, support, and service elements could add 400 to 1,000 attached personnel across kitchens, wagon lines, workshops, and headquarters trains. The purpose remained constant: release German soldiers for fighting echelons while maintaining the movement of ammunition, food, and engineer stores over mine-belted approaches and dust-choked roads. At the tactical edge of the Kursk salient, pioneer tasks defined risk exposure. Minefields measured in kilometers required clearance lanes wide enough for battalions and assault guns. Under German non-commissioned officers, auxiliary labor moved fascines, sandbags, and Bangalore torpedoes forward after dusk. Ammunition carriers hauled 7.92 mm belts, 75 mm and 105 mm rounds, and 50 mm mortar bombs, from regimental dumps to company caches using handcarts and horse teams. Medical detachments trained selected auxiliaries as litter bearers to move casualties from forward foxholes to battalion aid posts under artillery interdiction. Weapons policy generally restricted attached personnel to unarmed status. Exceptions appeared in short-lived sentry posts or emergency holding lines, where captured Mosin carbines or Kar 98K rifles were issued with limited ammunition and collected at relief. Reports from corps staffs recorded that throughput of engineer materials and small arms ammunition rose when auxiliary teams operated in continuous shifts, allowing German drivers to shuttle loads closer to the line. Rearward of the assault zones, the rail and road network consumed manpower. Trains carrying fuel, propellant charges, and replacement parts required loading and unloading cycles synchronized with divisional daily fire plans. Auxiliary drivers took routine convoy legs, leaving German drivers to push through contested road segments, where recovery of disabled Opel Blitz trucks or horse teams under fire was expected. Workshop sections recorded faster turnaround of damaged machine guns and mortars when auxiliary fitters, often former mechanics, handled cleaning spare parts fetching and basic assemblies under German armorers. Field bakeries maintained bread output at rates aligned with divisional ration tables when 20 to 40 auxiliary helpers remained on continuous kneading, firing, and hauling duty. Security operations peaked in the same months, especially in Belarus, and along key lines such as Orsha-Smolensk and Bryansk-Gomel. Rail sabotage intensified during Soviet counteroffensives, Kutuzov and Rumyantsev. Police regiments and security divisions deployed Schutzmannschaft companies with former prisoners in mixed posts, bridge guards, culvert patrols, and repair train escorts. Command measures reflected earlier experience: mixed sentry pairs, restricted ammunition, frequent relief of isolated posts, and periodic shifting between districts to limit local ties. When large sweeps were ordered through forest belts to clear partisan bases, auxiliary personnel moved as porters and guides, while German infantry, artillery, and armored cars conducted the main encirclement and search tasks. Civilian effects tracked along these operations. Regulated market days around garrisons created barter channels for food and clothing, while curfews and requisition quotas attempted to structure exchanges and movement. The second half of 1943 saw the transition from peak offensive employment to broad retreats. After Soviet breakthroughs on the Orel and Belgorod-Kharkov axes, German armies withdrew to successive lines on the Desina and Dnieper. Attached detachments either marched with parent units, transferred to the nearest Gulag, or were reassigned by corps quartermasters to formations short of drivers and pioneers. As crossings over the Desina and later the Dnieper were prepared, pioneer commands intensified road repair and bridging work, using auxiliary labor to fell timber, assemble trestles, and haul wire. The same period recorded higher disappearance rates from isolated depots and perimeter posts. Countermeasures concentrated detachments near divisional train parks and under closer guard, reducing the use of isolated pickets where defection risk and partisan pressure were greatest. Parallel developments unfolded in the West to reduce defection risk near home regions and to economize manpower along quieter fronts. Army and Army group staffs transferred Eastern battalions raised from prisoners of war and civilians to coastal defense in France and the Low Countries. By late 1943 to early 1944, dozens of such battalions, totaling on the order of 50 to 80 units with roughly 50,000 to 70,000 men, garrisoned sectors of the Atlantic Wall under German officers. Their tasks mirrored earlier rear area employment: trench maintenance, wire repair, beach obstacle work, and manning of strongpoint sentry posts, with combat roles limited and tightly supervised. This redistribution did not eliminate auxiliaries in the East. It shifted some of the burden away from armies engaged in continuous retreats while anchoring garrison duties with troops judged more reliable away from familiar terrain. Within Luftwaffe and artillery rear services, auxiliary roles expanded into anti-aircraft and depot security. Flak batteries employed unarmed or lightly armed auxiliaries as ammunition handlers and spotters, particularly in rail junctions subject to air attack. Artillery parks used auxiliary teams to inventory and move shells according to firing tables, reducing delays between corps allocations and divisional expenditure. The cumulative effect across services was measurable in outputs: kilometers of road maintained, tonnage of ammunition delivered per day, numbers of evacuated wounded reaching divisional clearing stations within prescribed time windows. These figures sustained quota renewals at corps conferences even as debate continued about reliability near the front. Soviet institutions reached an organizational apex in response. In April 1943, counterintelligence structures were consolidated under new commands tasked with frontline security and rear area filtration. Field directives standardized interrogation templates for captured auxiliaries, distinguishing between unarmed laborers, security personnel, and those who had performed armed tasks in proximity to combat. Frontline propaganda targeted auxiliary posts during retreats, offering case-by-case review to those who crossed lines and specifying criminal categories for participation in punitive operations. As Soviet forces advanced, forward filtration points moved with armies, establishing an administrative presence that signaled probable post-capture procedures to individuals weighing defection or continued service. The peak phase also produced boundary cases that complicated later classification. During emergency defenses on the Dnieper Bend in October-November 1943, improvised alarm units formed from trained personnel, headquarters clerks, and attached labor-manned intermediate trenches while rifle battalions repositioned. In these instances, auxiliaries crossed from labor into combat-adjacent roles under direct German command, often with rifles issued for hours rather than on permanent tables. For commanders, the immediate outcome was continuity of defense. For individuals, the record of having held a post with a weapon, even briefly, would later influence how repatriation commissions evaluated their cases. By early 1944, the auxiliary system at its largest combined 3 strands: unit-attached Hiwis embedded in divisional services on the Eastern Front, security and police units in occupied territories conducting rail protection and sweeps, and Eastern battalions redistributed to coastal defense in the West. The distribution reflected a balance between operational necessity, perceived security risks, and administrative capacity. For the German side, peak employment preserved mobility and service functions as formal strengths declined. For the Soviet side, peak filtration and classification capacity prepared for mass encounters with returnees as fronts advanced. For local civilians, peak auxiliary deployment meant more frequent contact with mixed language work details, guarded depots, and regulated markets tied to garrisons. The phenomenon had reached its widest geographic spread and functional diversity, setting the conditions under which it would be tested by the campaigns of 1944. Retreat in 1944 forced all actors to adapt, as Soviet offensives from January to August pushed German fronts from the Dnieper to the Vistula and from Leningrad to the Baltic. Attached auxiliaries were reassigned to tasks that matched a moving defense. Pioneer staffs used mixed teams to lay and lift mines, fell timber for roadblocks, and rig bridge demolitions. Ammunition throughput remained decisive. Corps parks calculated daily needs in hundreds of tons for artillery groups supporting 6,000 to 9,000 German effectives per infantry division. Auxiliary drivers maintained routine convoy legs, freeing German drivers for the last kilometers under artillery interdiction. Medical chains trained auxiliary stretcher bearers to clear casualty collection points within set time windows, a requirement that intensified when road nets collapsed under mud or air attack. Operation Bagration, in June to July 1944, demonstrated the scale of the problem. 4 Soviet fronts committed more than 1,600,000 personnel, with 4,000 to 5,200 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 20,000 guns and mortars against Army Group Center, fielding roughly 800,000 to 850,000 personnel, with far fewer armored vehicles. As pockets formed at Vitebsk, Bobruisk, and Minsk, divisional trains attempted to evacuate workshops, field bakeries, and medical sections that included attached labor. Many detachments were overrun or cut off. Others were redirected to improvised rear guards, where auxiliary personnel hauled ammunition to temporary strongpoints while German rifle companies maneuvered to break contact. After the Minsk encirclement closed on July 3rd, surviving German formations reassembled on successive lines along the Neman and Vistula. Quartermasters in these regrouped divisions recorded immediate shortages in drivers and pioneer labor, and requested replenishment from dulags west of the Bug and Nauru. Security doctrine adjusted in parallel. Rail sabotage expanded on the Gomel-Minsk-Vilnius corridors and along the Polisi lines feeding the front. Police regiments and security divisions consolidated guard posts, reducing isolated culvert or bridge sentries, and concentrating protection in mixed posts, close to repair detachments. Former prisoners serving in Schutzmannschaft companies were redeployed in larger groups as patrol screens and porters during sweeps, while German rifle and machine gun teams provided the core firepower. When fronts collapsed, these units faced stark choices: march with German columns, disperse locally, or attempt to cross to Soviet lines under the conditions announced by Soviet political departments. Reports from districts with dense forest belts showed higher disappearance rates than from open agricultural zones, reinforcing earlier assessments that terrain and proximity to Soviet forces determined outcomes as much as formal policy. On the Western theater, adaptation took the form of redistribution. From late 1943 through mid-1944, dozens of Eastern battalions raised from POWs and civilians, often Georgian, Azerbaijani, Turkestani, or mixed Ost contingents, garrisoned coastal sectors in France and the Low Countries under German officers. In June 1944, when Allied forces landed in Normandy with approximately 156,000 personnel, on D-Day supported by thousands of ships and aircraft, several Atlantic Wall divisions in the Cotentin and Calvados sectors counted multiple Eastern battalions among their strongpoint garrisons. Employment mirrored earlier rear area roles, trench maintenance, wire repair, and sentry duty under close supervision. Where Allied assaults isolated strongpoints, local German commanders sometimes consolidated garrisons and withdrew mixed detachments inland. In other cases, Eastern companies surrendered or dispersed. Transfers of selected Eastern battalions to the West achieved the intended reduction of defection risk near home regions, but did not remove the core dependence on auxiliary labor in the East. Within the German Field Army, unit organization shifted toward formations labeled Volksgrenadier in late 1944, designed to economize manpower with higher automatic weapon density. In practice, divisions still required the same service backbone. Planning tables continued to assign 5 to 8% of headcount to attached auxiliaries in kitchens, workshops, and pioneer tasks when available, with the caveat that collapsing rail capacity and camp evacuations often prevented deliveries. Weapon policy for attached personnel remained restrictive, but retreat created boundary cases. During withdrawals across the Bug, Naro, and later the Vistula, alarm detachments assembled from headquarters clerks, trained personnel, and attached labor held intermediate trenches for hours to cover crossings. Documentation noted the issue of rifles for specific periods and the collection of weapons after relief, a detail that later affected post-war classification. Soviet institutions adapted their filtration system to mass returns. As fronts recovered territories, forward filtration points moved with Army rear services. Procedures distinguished unarmed labor under guard from armed service in police or punitive roles and from temporary arming in emergency defensive tasks. Interrogation templates recorded dates, unit labels at company or battalion level, names of German commanders, and whether weapons were issued on tables or for specific posts. The immediate military aim was to separate individuals for redeployment, investigation, or detention, without delaying the forward movement of armies. Political departments paired this with targeted leaflets and broadcasts aimed at auxiliaries on German lines during retreats, promising case-by-case review while warning of criminal liability for participation in specific categories of operations. Adaptation also occurred at the level of small practice. Divisional medics reported fewer evacuation delays when auxiliary stretcher bearers received standardized instruction in hand signals and route marking with colored panels. Pioneers improved road survivability by pairing auxiliary laborers with German NCOs trained to prioritize culvert repair and drainage, a lesson drawn from repeated washouts in spring and autumn. Quartermasters reworked convoy schedules so that auxiliary drivers handled daylight legs behind fighter cover, while German drivers managed dusk and night segments toward forward dumps. These incremental changes did not alter the strategic balance, but they sustained divisional functions under pressure. Not all adaptation preserved cohesion. When German forces evacuated the Baltic states in autumn 1944, detachments recruited locally faced constrained options. Some moved by sea with elements of Army Group North toward East Prussia. Others were returned to camps for redistribution. A portion disappeared into local populations. In the Carpathians and Transylvania, mountain terrain complicated motor transport. Auxiliary labor shifted toward pack trains, timber felling, and road maintenance under early snow. Commanders recorded that output per laborer declined in high-altitude sectors compared with steppe roads, and they adjusted quotas accordingly, trading numbers for proximity and supervision to limit losses. By the end of 1944, resistance and adaptation produced a narrowed but still functioning system. On the German side, divisions in the field kept kitchens, workshops, and pioneer sections operating with attached labor wherever rail and camp structures still fed them. In the West, Eastern battalions fulfilled garrison roles with mixed performance under the strain of Allied operations. On the Soviet side, advancing fronts combined battlefield pressure with administrative mechanisms that managed the return or capture of former POWs, distinguishing categories by role, time, and place. For civilians across reoccupied zones, the visible markers of the system persisted for a time. Work parties without insignia, guarded depots, regulated market days adjacent to garrisons, before dissolving as lines moved westward. The auxiliary phenomenon adjusted to the demands of retreat and reoccupation, maintaining its functional purpose while narrowing in scope, and setting conditions for the decisions that would define the war's final phase. The turning point for auxiliaries emerged from converging decisions taken between summer 1944 and spring 1945. On the Eastern Front, the destruction of Army Group Center in June-July 1944 removed a major reservoir of unit-attached labor. Thousands of drivers, kitchen hands, and pioneer workers disappeared with encircled divisions at Vitebsk, Bobruisk, and Minsk. In August-September, withdrawals to the Neman and Vistula left detachments behind when freight yards were overrun or bridges failed. On the Western Front, the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, and the subsequent breakout in July-August exposed Eastern battalions used for coastal defense to combined arms assaults they were not organized to resist. Several were captured intact, others fragmented during inland withdrawals. The effect was structural. The pool of auxiliaries embedded in German formations declined sharply, not by policy reversal, but through loss formations that had sustained the system. German high command responses reflected both scarcity and political shifts. Following the 20th of July, 1944, attempt on Hitler, control over replacement and security structures tightened under SS influence. The Volkssturm Decree of October 18, 1944. Mobilized German males aged roughly 16 to 60 within the Reich's borders, but it did not create a substitute for the auxiliary labor that kept field kitchens, workshops, and pioneer sections functioning. Army Group A and later Army Group Vistula authorized wider emergency arming of attached personnel at river crossings and urban strongpoints, rifles issued for specified hours, ammunition counted and collected, because rifle companies lacked numbers to hold intermediate lines. In parallel, Army and Corps staffs accelerated transfers of Eastern battalions away from zones where Soviet advances made defection more likely, sending some to the Netherlands, Denmark, or North German coasts. These moves preserved garrison capacity in the West, but further reduced labor at the main fronts. A separate development was the political rebranding of certain formations. On the 14th of November 1944, representatives met to announce a Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia and to frame a Russian Liberation Army under Andrei Vlasov. In practice, most Eastern battalions remained under existing German command structures. Only a limited number of divisions were reorganized under the new label during late 1944, early 1945. Where conversions occurred, cadres came from former POWs, earlier OST units, and camp recruits. The shift affected insignia, propaganda, and promised status more than immediate field employment. In sectors along the Oder, in March-April 1945, some newly designated units took part in defensive actions. Elsewhere, they moved west seeking to surrender to Allied forces. For individuals, the rebranding offered a potential change in legal identity without guaranteeing different treatment if captured by the Red Army. Soviet decisions created an equally significant hinge. As fronts advanced into Poland and East Prussia, forward filtration points and Smersh sections moved with armies to classify large numbers of returnees. The Yalta Conference in February 1945 established arrangements among allies for repatriation of Soviet citizens, setting the conditions under which Eastern battalions and auxiliaries captured in the West would be handed over. Knowledge of these mechanisms spread unevenly among detachments. In January-April 1945, As the Vistula, Oder, and East Prussian offensives advanced, political departments broadcast messages promising review for those who crossed the line and warning of criminal liability for armed participation in punitive operations. The combination of battlefield pressure and administrative clarity produced a cascade of surrenders from isolated posts, particularly where detachments had been armed only for local defense and were cut off from parent units. Urban battles concentrated the turning point in specific places. In Budapest, December 1944, February 1945, mixed garrisons included unit-attached labor and Eastern contingents detailed to kitchens, depots, and trench work. As the siege tightened, emergency arming blurred prior distinctions between labor and combat-adjacent roles. In Königsberg and on the Somland Peninsula, January-April 1945, detachments manned roadblocks and supply dumps inside shrinking perimeters. Mass capitulations followed local collapses. In Berlin, April-May 1945, administrative records show attached personnel concentrated in rear services. Where they held posts, it was typically within ad hoc alarm units under direct German command for limited intervals. Across these cities, the visible markers of the auxiliary system, camp codes on discs, depot clothing without insignia, mixed language work parties, appeared in surrender columns and at collection points, after which Soviet classification procedures assigned individuals to distinct categories. Allied advances in the West produced a different pattern. In Normandy's aftermath and during operations in the Low Countries, September to November 1944, Eastern battalions captured by British and American forces entered POW enclosures separate from German units. Administrative records tracked them as non-German personnel, pending decisions on repatriation. In early 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine, additional Eastern companies and battalions surrendered intact. News about repatriation agreements motivated choices in April-May. Some units moved toward British or American lines to avoid encounter with the Red Army. Others disintegrated locally. The outcome depended on timing and location. Coastal garrisons in the Netherlands and Denmark often capitulated to Western allies, while units in central Germany were more likely to meet Soviet forces first. By spring 1945, the turning point had hardened into an end condition. German formations attempting to hold the Oder, Neisse, and Alpine redoubts lacked the administrative depth to receive or sustain new auxiliary contingents. Rail and camp systems that once fed attached labor had broken down. Orders that once specified rations and curfews for Hiwis gave way to emergency instructions for alarm detachments, bridge demolitions, and last-ditch defenses. On the Soviet side, the filtration apparatus anticipated the post-combat phase, with categories and commission procedures in place to process hundreds of thousands of returnees, prisoners of war, civilian laborers, security personnel, and those who had held armed posts. For individuals, the calculus shifted from daily survival in a functioning system to choices at points of surrender, to whom, where, and under what administrative framework. The measurable inflection lay not in a single decree, but in the alignment of three developments between late 1944 and early 1945, battlefield losses that erased the organizational homes of auxiliaries, political moves that reclassified some units without expanding their secure base, and inter-allied agreements that defined the legal path after capture. Together, these ended the period in which auxiliary service functioned as a routine component of divisional life and began the period in which outcomes were determined by capitulation, classification, and repatriation. The final months of the war converted auxiliary service from a routine support mechanism into a liability measured in routes of surrender, categories of custody, and paperwork. In April-May 1945, capitulations on the Oder, in East Prussia and in Bohemia, placed attached personnel alongside German troops at collection points run by Soviet armies, while Western advances across northern Germany and into Denmark and the Netherlands brought Eastern battalions into British and American POW cages. Administrative practice split immediately by jurisdiction. In Soviet-controlled zones, attached laborers, security personnel, and members of Ost field formations were processed under Red Army and NKVD instructions that distinguished unarmed camp work from armed service near combat or participation in rear area police actions. In Western zones, Allied commands registered Eastern companies and battalions as non-German POWs or displaced persons, pending transfer under repatriation arrangements concluded between late 1944 and early 1945. Withdrawal and disbandment followed predictable chains. German divisions that capitulated intact turned over roles for train, medical, and pioneer sections that included attached names with camp or detachment codes. Where units had dissolved, auxiliaries appeared in mixed surrender columns without documentation. At ports on the Baltic and North Sea, garrisons with Eastern companies surrendered to British commands. Inland strongpoints from the Eames to the Elbe produced smaller groups. In Czechoslovakia and Austria, alarmed detachments formed in April. Clerks, drivers, and attached labor temporarily armed marched to surrender points with army staffs. The immediate status of an individual depended on the receiving authority. Red Army field commands assigned returnees to forward filtration points. Western camps segregated non-Germans from Wehrmacht POWs and notified liaison missions responsible for repatriation. Filtration inside the Soviet system was formalized by mid-1945. Field points and stationary camps recorded identity, unit labels down to company or detachment, place and months of service, and whether weapons had been issued on permanent tables or for specific posts. Archival summaries from 1945 to 1946 show outcomes distributed across several main channels. A majority, well over half, were cleared for return to civilian life. A substantial share was redrafted into the Red Army or labor service units. A smaller fraction was transferred to NKVD jurisdiction for further investigation or sentencing. The remainder fell into medical evacuation, industrial assignment, or continued screening. The decisive variables were role, unarmed kitchen or road work versus armed sentry or police tasks. Locality, whether service occurred in areas with documented punitive operations, and duration. Individuals who had held weapons within ad hoc alarm units at bridges or urban strongpoints were usually recorded separately from those who had worked in the kitchens or workshops under guard. Western custody produced a different sequence. British and American commands used existing POW infrastructure, enclosures, interrogation centers, and DP camps, while liaison officers from Soviet repatriation missions compiled lists for transfer. Between mid-1945 and 1947, large-scale movements by rail and ship returned the majority of Soviet citizens from Western zones to Soviet control under inter-Allied agreements. Not all cases were straightforward. Some Eastern companies included men who claimed non-Soviet nationality or pre-1939 citizenship in territories later annexed by the USSR. Others belonged to groups with separate political committees formed in 1944 to 1945. Allied practice varied by case and month. Units captured intact on coastal garrisons often moved as whole groups. Individuals detached earlier from their companies could be classified as DPs and remain in camps administered by UNRRA or national authorities until their cases were resolved. The outcome depended on documentation, timing, and the posture of the receiving Allied command. On the German side, the administrative end of auxiliary service was simple and irreversible. With the capitulation of German forces on May 8 to 9, 1945, the Wehrmacht and police command chains that had recruited, housed, and rationed attached personnel ceased to exist. The depot ledgers that had recorded credits in camp scrip or company books had no further standing. Identification discs with Dulag or Stalag codes became evidence for interrogators rather than entitlement at quartermaster stores. Former German officers could testify to an individual's tasks, but that testimony carried weight only insofar as it aligned with the categories recognized by Soviet or Allied screening. Civilian environments through which detachments had moved also changed rapidly. In territories retaken by the Red Army, market days around garrisons closed or shifted to Army-run distribution points. Local authorities reopened schools and administrations with lists of residents who had served in German-formed police or guard units. Those lists captured only part of the auxiliary phenomenon. Kitchen hands, drivers, and pioneer laborers attached to divisions had left fewer local records than Schutzmannschaft companies posted in fixed districts. In Western Europe, coastal sectors garrisoned by Eastern battalions returned to national control. Municipal authorities passed names of captured or surrendered non-German personnel to Allied commands, which then coordinated with repatriation missions. Civilian interactions that had involved barter with mixed-language work parties ended as garrisons dissolved. Comparative casualty accounting framed the immediate consequences. Of roughly 5.5 to 5.7 million Red Army soldiers taken prisoner during the war, a large proportion, on the order of several million, did not survive captivity. Among survivors, a fraction had served as attached laborers, security personnel, or in Ost units for varying periods before capture or surrender. German combat formations in 1945, many at 25 to 40% of their 1941 authorized strengths, lost the attached labor that had supported kitchens, workshops, and pioneer tasks when the system broke down. Repatriation did not concern them beyond the record of surrender. For Soviet institutions, the decisive numbers were not the wartime auxiliary totals, but the post-war processing flows. How many returnees passed filtration in a given month? How many were redrafted? How many were sent to labor battalions or transferred to penal jurisdiction? And how many required medical or special handling? Legal frameworks shaped those flows without eliminating case-by-case judgment. Soviet decrees issued in 1943 to 1945 defined responsibility for collaboration and set penalties for participation in punitive operations. At the same time, Red Army orders established that service performed under coercion and without arms would be treated differently from voluntary armed participation. Commission minutes from 1945 to 1946 show panels composed of military, party, and security representatives weighing duration, location, and specific duties when assigning categories. Western Allied practice focused less on substantive evaluation of wartime roles and more on processing under repatriation agreements. Where allegations of atrocities existed, cases could be held for investigation or trial under occupation law. But most Eastern companies moved through administrative channels toward handover. Outcomes varied by region and timing. Men captured with Atlantic Wall garrisons in the Netherlands and Denmark often spent months in Western camps before transfer. Those taken with Army Group Kurland in May 1945 entered Soviet custody soon after capitulation. Individuals who crossed front lines locally in early 1945 sometimes benefited from the presence of forward filtration points that could process cases quickly. Those captured en masse in urban surrenders faced longer screening. In all cases, documentation, camp discs, company rolls, paybook notes, and corroborating testimony replaced the divisional daily orders that had once defined a person's place in the auxiliary system. The immediate consequences, therefore, consisted of three linked movements: the dissolution of German administrative structures that had sustained auxiliary labor, the classification and redistribution of individuals by the authorities who received them, and the closure of civilian spaces that had supported exchanges between garrisons and local populations. Each movement had measurable outputs: numbers repatriated per month, percentages cleared or reassigned, counts of cases transferred to security jurisdiction, but none altered the central fact that by mid-1945, auxiliary service no longer existed as a functioning wartime role. What remained were files, categories, and the personal trajectories that would pass into the debates over responsibility, coercion, and survival that followed the end of combat. The long-term significance of auxiliary service lies in how institutions, communities, and later researchers organized the facts of coercion, survival, and military utility into distinct narratives. In the Soviet Union, post-war law and party guidance framed categories that had been applied in filtration: unarmed labor under guard, service in police and security units, temporary arming in emergency detachments, and continuous armed service in field formations. Between 1945 and the early 1950s, these categories guided sentencing, reassignment to labor units, or clearance to civilian life. From 1953 to 1956, amnesties and releases altered many outcomes without rewriting the underlying classifications. Later decrees in the late 1980s and early 1990s revised the legal status of several groups, including many former POWs who had not served in punitive roles. The lasting administrative footprint is visible in case files that record dates, detachment codes, and specific duties, evidence that shaped personal trajectories for decades after the war. In Germany and successor states, the legacy unfolded along different axes. For the armed forces, auxiliary labor had been a measurable input. Kilometers of road maintained, tons of ammunition delivered, numbers of wounded evacuated within set time limits. After May 1945, these outputs disappeared from military accounting and reappeared in legal proceedings, pension rules, and debates over the character of the Eastern War. West German and later Unified German scholarship incorporated captured files from Corps prisoner of war officers, divisional quartermasters, and police regiments, while Eastern European archives opened documentation on Schutzmannschaft and local security units. The term Hilfswillige, once a routine administrative label, became a focal point in studies that separated roles by place, period, and command chain. Researchers stressed the distinction between unit-attached laborers in kitchens and pioneer sections, Eastern battalions under Army command, and police or security formations under SS and police leaders. The result is a layered historiography that resists single explanations. Numbers remain central to that historiography. Of the roughly 5.5 to 5.7 million Red Army soldiers taken prisoner between 1941 and 1945, a large share perished in captivity, especially during the winter of 1941 to 1942. Among survivors, an undetermined fraction passed through auxiliary roles for weeks or months, often unarmed and under guard, while a smaller fraction served in armed security posts or in Eastern battalions. German divisional returns from 1942 to 1943 show attached auxiliaries commonly at 5 to 10% of headcount in infantry divisions, concentrated in services rather than rifle companies. Police and security commands in occupied territories recorded higher proportions during sweeps or railguard operations. These figures are uneven by sector and month. They establish orders of magnitude rather than a single total. Post-war debates have revolved around how to map those orders of magnitude onto moral and legal categories that were themselves products of wartime policy. Memory at the local level followed distinct timelines. In regions of Belarus, Ukraine, the Baltic states, and the northwestern Russian oblasts, lists of individuals who served in German-formed police units entered post-war municipal and judicial records in the late 1940s. By contrast, men who had worked in divisional kitchens or pioneer detachments left few fixed traces in local files, since their assignments moved with field units. Families reconstructed service histories from camp discs, paybook notations, or mentions in German unit diaries. In Western Europe, coastal communities that had hosted Eastern battalions recorded surrenders in 1944 to 1945 and the subsequent removal of these units to Allied camps. Local memory linked these episodes to the larger story of occupation and liberation rather than to Eastern Front categories. The asymmetry of records, fixed units leaving more visible traces than moving detachments, shaped post-war remembrance. Legal proceedings created another layer. Trials in the Soviet Union in 1946 to 1947 and subsequent years examined members of police battalions and persons identified in punitive operations, with outcomes that depended on location, documented actions, and witness testimony. In Germany and Austria, courts addressed cases involving crimes in occupied territories. Some proceedings drew on the same files that researchers later used to quantify auxiliary roles. Internationally, agreements on repatriation concluded during 1945 to 1947 framed transfers from Western custody. The administrative history of those agreements, ship manifests, rail convoys, and camp rolls, has become a separate field of study concerned with how categories negotiated during the war translated into peacetime law. Operational analysis has treated auxiliaries as a variable in a larger equation about the endurance of German formations on the Eastern Front. Divisions that entered 1941 with approximately 15,000 personnel and fought 1942 to 1943 at 6,500 to 10,500 effectives relied on attached labor to keep kitchens, workshops, and pioneer tasks functioning. Records from Army Groups North, Center, and South show that daily ammunition throughput, bread output, and trench maintenance improved when auxiliaries were present in planned numbers. At the same time, security incidents, desertions from isolated posts, and the need for close supervision reduced the net benefit in particular terrains and seasons. The literature weighs these gains and losses against other determinants: armament production, fuel supply, rail capacity, and attrition rates, to estimate how far auxiliary labor extended the operational life of units without changing strategic outcomes. Comparative perspectives broaden the frame. Other belligerents employed prisoner or local labor in varying forms. Italian and French POWs worked in agriculture and industry in Germany. Local auxiliaries served in garrisons across occupied Europe. National legions drew recruits from political and regional groups. The Eastern Front case stands out for scale, mortality in the prisoner population, and the proximity of labor to large-scale combat. This comparison does not equalize experiences. It sets a baseline for evaluating how doctrines, logistics, and law interact when states mobilize non-citizen or captive manpower in war. The cultural legacy is distributed across museums, memorials, and academic debates. Exhibitions on the war in Eastern Europe increasingly include sections on prisoner of war camps, Gulag and Stalag systems, and the range of auxiliary roles. Memorials at former campsites focus on prisoner mortality. Displays sometimes mention recruitment for labor detachments. University curricula and research centers use divisional returns, police records, and filtration files to teach students how to separate categories, track individuals across changing jurisdictions, and evaluate quantitative claims. The emphasis is methodological: define terms, identify command chains, and match claims to dated documents. For individuals and families, the legacy is granular. Service as a kitchen hand in a field bakery attached to an infantry division for 3 months in 1942 may appear in a file as a short notation. Participation in a police sweep in a named district may generate multi-page testimonies and maps. Post-war outcomes differ accordingly. Clearance in 1945 with redrafting to a labor unit, detention followed by release in the 1950s, or later legal review in the 1990s. Each case sits at the intersection of wartime necessity, administrative categorization, and the reach of the documentation. Researchers who reconstruct such paths assemble fragments from both sides of the front, German ledgers and Soviet commission minutes, to produce a chronology that neither archive alone can supply. The historical significance of auxiliaries thus resides in 3 durable insights. First, large armies and protracted campaigns convert captive labor into operational capacity when logistics and attrition force adaptation. The form this takes is constrained by doctrine, security policy, and transport. Second, legal and administrative categories created during war shape post-war lives for decades, even as amnesties and rehabilitations modify outcomes. Third, accurate description requires separating roles by time, place, and command, using verifiable numbers and named units rather than general labels. These insights do not harmonize competing narratives. They establish shared standards. On that basis, the subject moves from argument about motives to analysis of structures, from isolated anecdotes to documented sequences, and from assumptions to records that place each decision by commanders, guards, and prisoners within the map systems of camps, roads, railheads, and field formations that connected the front to the rear.